Moving into your first apartment alone is supposed to be exciting, right? That's what Jake thought when he signed the lease for his new place in the city. After years of sharing cramped spaces with roommates who never did their dishes and blasted music at 3 in the morning, he finally had his own space. A quiet corner apartment with decent lighting, hardwood floors, and most importantly, no one else's mess to deal with. He could work on his design projects in peace, keep his own schedule, and finally have the kind of organized life he'd been dreaming about. The building was one of those older places with character. You know the type. Creaky floors, vintage radiators that clanked at night, and walls thin enough that you could hear conversations from next door if someone talked loud enough. But Jake didn't mind. The rent was reasonable, the location was perfect for his work commute, and the landlord seemed decent enough. He spent his first weekend setting everything up exactly how he wanted it. His desk faced the window. His books were alphabetized, and his kitchen actually stayed clean because he was the only one using it. His neighbors seemed normal enough from what little he'd seen. There was an elderly couple downstairs who always smiled and said good morning. A young family across the hall with a toddler who occasionally ran up and down the corridor. And then, there was the woman next door. He'd seen her a few times in passing. She had paint-stained clothes most days, carried canvas bags full of art supplies, and always seemed to be in the middle of some creative project. Her apartment door was often decorated with random things, like paper flowers or chalk drawings. She'd wave when they crossed paths, flash a bright smile, and say hi before disappearing into her place. Jake learned her name was Riley from the mailboxes downstairs. She seemed friendly, but in that artistic, free-spirited way that was completely foreign to his structured lifestyle. Her apartment was the opposite of his. Through the brief glimpses he'd caught when her door was open, he could see organized chaos. Paintings everywhere, projects in various states of completion, music always playing. It was like creativity had exploded in there and just decided to stay. She had people over often too. He'd hear laughter, conversations about art theory, and sometimes the sound of furniture being moved around for who knows what reason. He kept his interactions with her polite but brief. A nod in the hallway, a quick smile, maybe a comment about the weather if they ended up at the mailboxes at the same time. Jake wasn't antisocial or anything, he just valued his quiet routine. After dealing with chaotic roommates for so long, he'd learned to appreciate solitude. His life had a rhythm now. Wake up, coffee, work on design projects, maybe hit the gym, come home, make dinner, watch something relaxing. Sleep. Repeat. It was predictable, sure, but predictable felt good after years of unpredictability. Riley's lifestyle seemed to be the exact opposite. She kept irregular hours, sometimes painting until 2 in the morning based on the soft music that drifted through the walls. She'd leave her apartment at random times, coming back with bags full of supplies or weird objects she'd probably found at thrift stores. Once he saw her carrying what looked like an old mannequin up the stairs. He didn't ask. It wasn't his business what creative projects she was working on. The thing about living alone is that you get comfortable in your bubble. You create this little world where everything makes sense and follows your rules. Jake had his bubble perfectly constructed. He knew exactly how his days would go, what he'd eat, when he'd work, when he'd relax. It was peaceful, controlled, safe. He had no idea that this carefully built bubble was about to pop in the most unexpected, bizarre, and absolutely mortifying way possible. Looking back now, he wishes someone had warned him. Maybe put a note on his door that said, "Prepare for the unexpected," or "Life's about to get weird." But nobody warns you about these things. Nobody tells you that one random Saturday morning, your entire perspective on normalcy is going to shatter. Nobody prepares you for the moment when you open your door, expecting maybe a package delivery or a neighbor asking to borrow sugar, and instead you're faced with a situation so surreal that your brain just completely stops working. But that Saturday morning was still a few weeks away. For now, Jake was blissfully unaware, living his quiet, organized life, thinking he had everything figured out. He had no clue that his eccentric neighbor next door was about to become the main character in the strangest story he'd ever have to tell. That particular Saturday started like any other weekend morning. Jake had stayed up a bit late the night before finishing a client project. So when his alarm went off at 8, he'd hit snooze a few times. The sun was streaming through his bedroom window, and he was in that comfortable half-asleep state where you're aware you should get up, but your bed feels too good to leave. He was dreaming about something mundane, probably work-related, when suddenly there was this loud banging on his door. Not knocking. Banging. The kind of urgent pounding that makes your heart jump into your throat because you know something is wrong. Jake jolted awake, his mind immediately racing through possibilities. Fire? Emergency? Someone hurt? He practically fell out of bed, stumbling over his blanket, disoriented and running on pure adrenaline. The banging continued, even more frantic now, and he could hear a voice shouting from the other side. "Please, I need help. Emergency." It was Riley's voice, high-pitched and panicked in a way that made every nerve in his body go on alert. He rushed to the door, in his wrinkled pajama pants and t-shirt, not even thinking about how he looked. His hands were shaking slightly as he fumbled with the lock. Through the door, he could hear what sounded like water running or dripping, and Riley was saying something about her bathroom and a disaster, and needing help immediately. His mind was creating all these scenarios. Maybe her apartment was flooding and she needed help shutting off the water. Maybe she'd slipped and hurt herself. Maybe there was a gas leak or an electrical problem. He finally got the lock undone and threw the door open, ready to spring into action, ready to help with whatever emergency was happening. He was prepared for almost anything, except what he actually saw. Riley was standing in his doorway, and for a split second, his brain couldn't process what he was looking at. She was completely covered in this white, plaster-like substance from head to toe. It was dripping off her, leaving puddles on the hallway floor. Her hair was matted with it, streaks of it running down her face, and she wasn't wearing any clothes. Not a single piece of clothing. Just this white coating that covered her like she'd been dipped in a giant vat of paint or plaster. Jake's brain just shut down. Completely. Like someone had pulled the plug on every thought process he had. He stood there, mouth slightly open, eyes wide, unable to form words or even coherent thoughts. Time seemed to slow down in that weird way it does when you're in shock. He was aware of everything in extreme detail. The way the plaster was cracking on her shoulders, the puddle forming at her feet, the fluorescent hallway light buzzing overhead. But he couldn't make sense of any of it. Riley was shivering, her teeth actually chattering, and she leaned against his doorframe like she was exhausted. She looked at his frozen expression and somehow, despite clearly being in distress, she managed this tired grin. She said, her voice a mix of desperation and something that might have been embarrassment, or maybe just exhaustion. "Say something." But Jake couldn't say anything. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. What do you say in a situation like this? What words exist in the English language that would be appropriate? His mind was screaming questions. Why is she covered in plaster? Why isn't she wearing clothes? Is this real? Am I still dreaming? Did I hit my head, and this is some weird unconscious fantasy? None of this made sense. "I know this looks insane," Riley rushed to explain, and that's when Jake's brain finally started working again. At least partially. "My bathroom pipes burst. I was doing this art project, a body casting thing, and I covered myself in plaster bandages, and then the pipes just exploded, and there's water everywhere, and the plaster got wet, and I couldn't move, and I finally broke free, but everything's flooding, and I can't get to my towels or clothes and my phone's dead, and you're the only person I know in this building, and I'm so sorry, but I really need help." The words came out in this rapid-fire stream, and Jake tried to focus on them instead of the bizarre visual in front of him. Pipes burst. Art project. Flooding. Needed help. Okay. Those were concrete things he could understand. Action items. Problems with solutions. Finally, Jake's survival instincts kicked in and overrode his shock. He stepped aside and gestured for Riley to come in, then immediately spun around to give her privacy while his face burned red. "Stay right there," he managed to say, his voice coming out higher than normal. He practically ran to his bathroom, grabbing every towel he owned. Bath towels, hand towels, that beach towel he never used. Everything. His hands were still shaking as he brought them back, holding them out while carefully keeping his eyes pointed at the ceiling. Riley wrapped herself in the towels, and Jake could hear her sigh of relief. "This is the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to me." Jake almost laughed at that, because he was pretty sure this was the most embarrassing thing that had ever happened to him too. And it wasn't even his emergency. Once she was covered, Jake finally felt safe enough to look in her general direction, though he still avoided direct eye contact. "Okay," he said, trying to sound calm and capable even though his heart was racing. Riley nodded, plaster still flaking off her hair onto his floor. The whole bathroom. The pipes under the sink just gave out. There's water everywhere. Jake grabbed his phone and called the building's emergency maintenance line. Of course, because it was Saturday morning, he got an answering service. He explained the situation, maybe leaving out some of the more bizarre details. And they promised to send someone within the hour. An hour. Great. He hung up and looked at Riley, who was sitting on his couch now, looking absolutely miserable despite being wrapped in half his linen closet. "Let me get you some actual clothes," he said, disappearing into his bedroom. He came back with sweatpants and the largest t-shirt he owned, setting them on the arm of the couch before retreating to his kitchen to give her privacy to change. He heard her moving around, and then she called out that she was decent. When he turned around, she looked like a completely different person, still covered in bits of drying plaster, but at least clothed. His clothes hung off her frame, but she'd managed to tie the sweatpants tight enough that they stayed up. "I should check your apartment," Jake said, grabbing his keys. "Make sure the water's not spreading to other units." They walked next door. And when Riley opened her door, Jake understood why she'd been so panicked. Her bathroom looked like a disaster zone. Water was still trickling from the broken pipe, the floor was flooded at least an inch deep, and there were wet plaster bandages everywhere. Her clothes were in a heap in the corner, completely soaked. Art supplies floated in the water like strange ships. Jake waded in and managed to find the water shut-off valve, stopping the flow. The damage was done. Though, Riley's bathroom was destroyed, and water had started seeping into her bedroom. She stood in the doorway looking at the mess, and Jake could see her shoulders slump. "My landlord is going to kill me," she said quietly. "And my art project is completely ruined. I've been working on that series for months. For the first time since the initial shock." Jake really looked at her face, instead of trying to avoid eye contact. She looked exhausted and defeated and on the verge of crying. The whole bizarre situation suddenly felt less funny and more genuinely awful. This wasn't just some weird story to tell later. This was a real person having a really terrible day. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's go back to my place. There's nothing we can do until maintenance gets here." Back in his apartment, he made coffee, while Riley tried to get the plaster out of her hair using his kitchen sink. It was a weirdly domestic scene considering they'd barely spoken more than pleasantries before today. Jake found himself telling her about the time he'd flooded his college dorm room trying to fix a leaky faucet, trying to make her feel less embarrassed. She laughed at his story. A real laugh. And some of the tension broke. The maintenance guy finally showed up an hour and a half later. By that time, Jake and Riley were sitting on his couch drinking their second cups of coffee, and the initial awkwardness had faded into something more comfortable. Riley had managed to get most of the plaster out of her hair, though she still had bits of it dried on her arms and neck. She'd been telling him about her art project, how she was creating a series of sculptures exploring themes of transformation and vulnerability. The irony of her current situation wasn't lost on either of them. The maintenance worker, a guy named Tom who'd seen everything in his 20 years working apartment buildings, assessed the damage and shook his head. The pipes in these old buildings were always a gamble, he explained. Riley's bathroom would need serious work. New pipes, new flooring, probably a new sink. It would take at least a week, maybe 2. In the meantime, her bathroom was unusable. Tom managed to set up a temporary fix to stop any more flooding, but that was about all he could do on a Saturday. Riley looked devastated when he left. 2 weeks without a bathroom, she said, running her hands through her still damp hair. How am I supposed to manage that? Jake found himself offering before he'd really thought it through. You can use my shower. I mean, we're neighbors. And it's partly the building's fault for having ancient pipes. It's not like you caused this on purpose. She looked at him with surprise, and maybe a bit of suspicion, like she was waiting for there to be strings attached to the offer. But Jake kept his expression genuine. It was just a shower. It wasn't weird to help out a neighbor in an emergency. Are you sure? She asked. I don't want to impose more than I already have. This morning was already beyond mortifying. It's fine, Jake assured her. Really. Just knock when you need to. And we'll work out a schedule. Or whatever. Riley's relief was visible, her whole body relaxing. You're a lifesaver. Seriously. I promise I'll make this up to you somehow. Over the next few days, they developed an odd routine. Riley would text him in the morning to ask if it was okay to come over and shower. She'd show up with her toiletries in a bag, use his bathroom quickly, and usually leave right after with profuse thank yous. But gradually, the visits got longer. She'd accept his offer of coffee. They'd chat about their days. Jake learned that Riley was a full-time artist, which explained the irregular hours and the constant stream of weird supplies. She did commissions, sold work in galleries, and taught art classes to kids on weekends. She learned that Jake was a freelance graphic designer who specialized in branding for small businesses. He liked the creative aspect but appreciated the structure of client deadlines and project scopes. They were complete opposites in almost every way. Riley was spontaneous and emotional, and always covered in some kind of art medium. Jake was planned and logical, and kept his apartment spotless. She worked in bursts of inspiration that could last all night. He kept strict working hours. She ate whatever random ingredients she had in her fridge combined in weird ways. He meal prepped on Sundays. By all logic, they shouldn't have gotten along at all. But somehow, they did. Riley started staying for breakfast sometimes. Then Jake started inviting her over for dinner when he'd made too much food, which, coincidentally, started happening more often. She showed him her art portfolio, and he was genuinely impressed by her talent. The sculptures and paintings had this raw, emotional quality that made you feel something even if you didn't understand art theory. He showed her some of his design work, and she gave him feedback from a visual artist's perspective that actually improved his projects. 3 weeks after the bathroom incident, Riley's apartment was finally fixed. She could shower in her own place again. Jake expected their daily interactions to stop, for things to go back to the polite stranger phase they'd been in before. But the morning after her bathroom was finished, there was a knock on his door. Riley stood there with a box of fancy pastries from the bakery down the street. Jake wasn't sick of her. Not even close. He realized he'd actually started looking forward to her visits, to their conversations, to the way she saw the world so differently from him. 6 months passed, and Jake couldn't really remember what his life had been like before Riley became a constant presence in it. They'd settled into this easy friendship that surprised everyone who knew them, including themselves. His apartment, once a sanctuary of careful order, now often had Riley's art supplies scattered on his coffee table, where they'd work on projects together. Her place, while still chaotic, had small signs of his influence, like the label maker he'd bought her to organize her paint collection. They grabbed dinner together several times a week. She dragged him to art gallery openings where he'd stand awkwardly drinking cheap wine while she networked with other artists. He convinced her to try his gym, which resulted in one hilarious session before she decided yoga at home was more her speed. Their neighbors assumed they were dating. But it wasn't like that. It was better than that, somehow. No pressure. No expectations. Just two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Jake had learned to be more spontaneous, saying yes to random adventures like midnight trips to the 24-hour diner, or last-minute road trips to see art installations in nearby cities. Riley had learned to be more organized, actually meeting deadlines for commissions and keeping a semi-regular schedule. They balanced each other in ways that made both of their lives better. His friends noticed he seemed happier, more relaxed. Her friends were just glad someone was making sure she ate regular meals and didn't stay up for 48 hours straight, working on projects. One Friday evening, they were at Jake's place sharing a bottle of wine and leftover pizza. Riley had been quiet all day, which was unusual for her. She kept starting to say something and then stopping, fidgeting with her wine glass in a way that made Jake nervous. Finally, she took a big gulp of wine and just blurted it out. "I need to tell you something about the bathroom incident." Jake looked up from his pizza, confused. "What about it?" "The landlord covered the repairs, right? Everything worked out." Riley shook her head, setting down her glass and looking directly at him for the first time that evening. "The pipes did burst. That part was true. And I was doing the body casting project. But I wasn't completely honest about everything." She took a breath. And Jake could see she was genuinely nervous, which made him nervous. "I had time to grab clothes before I came to your door. Not much time, but enough. I could have wrapped myself in my shower curtain or grabbed a robe or something. But I didn't." Jake sat very still, processing this information. "Why not?" His voice came out more curious than accusatory. Riley laughed, but it was an embarrassed sound. "Because I'd been working up the courage to actually talk to you for weeks. You seemed interesting and kind, and I thought you were attractive, but you always seemed so closed off. Like you had this wall up. Every time we crossed paths, I'd think, this time I'll start a real conversation, but then I'd chicken out and just say hi and run back to my apartment like an idiot." She was talking faster now, the words tumbling out like she'd been holding them in too long. "When the flood happened, I was panicking and also slightly tipsy from the wine I'd been drinking while working, and I had this absolutely insane thought. I figured I had nothing to lose. Either you'd think I was crazy and avoid me forever, which was basically the status quo anyway, or it would be so memorable that we'd have to actually acknowledge each other's existence. It was stupid and impulsive and completely ridiculous." Jake sat there, his pizza forgotten, trying to reorganize the past 6 months with this new information. The moment that had seemed like pure chaos and bad luck had been at least partially intentional. Riley was watching his face anxiously, waiting for his reaction. "Say something," she said, echoing her words from that morning. "Please. The suspense is killing me." And then Jake started laughing. Not a polite chuckle, but real, deep laughter that came from his chest. He laughed until tears formed in his eyes, until Riley started laughing too, even though she clearly wasn't sure what was funny. "That," he finally managed to say, "is the most ridiculous, bold, absolutely insane thing I've ever heard. You orchestrated the most embarrassing moment of my life as an introduction strategy? When you put it like that, it sounds even worse," Riley said, covering her face with her hands. But she was smiling behind them. Jake shook his head, still grinning. "You know what the crazy part is? It worked. I never would have talked to you otherwise. I would have just kept nodding in the hallway forever, too stuck in my routine to take a chance on meeting someone new." He meant it. Before that bizarre Saturday morning, he'd been so comfortable in his bubble that he was missing out on connections, experiences, and growth. Riley had literally crashed into his life in the most unconventional way possible, and it had changed everything for the better. She'd taught him that sometimes the best things in life come from moments of chaos and vulnerability. That taking risks, even embarrassing ones, can lead to beautiful outcomes. Riley lowered her hands, looking at him with hope and relief. So, we're good? You're not mad that I basically traumatized you on purpose? Jake raised his wine glass in a toast. To the worst and best introduction I've ever experienced. And to having a friend crazy enough to go through with something like that. They clinked glasses, both grinning like idiots. The truth was, Jake couldn't imagine his life without Riley in it now.